Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our native ancestors' stories and history alive while also sharing with you our native cultures, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And stay tuned for the end of each episode where we'll talk about some great ways to support Native causes and or Native-owned businesses. Let's get started.
I am more than a maker.
More than an athlete.
More than a pastor.
Chata ili finachili.
I am Choctaw proud.
We are the Choctaw Nation, and together we're more.
You are stronger than we. We have fought you so long as we had rifles and powder, but your arms are better than ours. Give us like weapons and turn us loose. We will fight you again, but we are worn out. We have no more heart. We have no provisions, no means to live. Your troops are everywhere. Our springs and waterholes are either occupied or overlooked by your young men. You have driven us from our last and best stronghold, and we have no more hearts. Do with as may seem good to you, but do not forget we are men and braves. Those were the words of Mescalero Chief Cadete to General Carlton in 1863. I'm very much excited to be with author and former guest W. Michael Farmer in this three-part series. Today, we'll start with book 1 of 3, Killer of Witches, The Life and Times of Yellow Boy, Mescalero Apache. We'll follow the journey of Yellow Boy, which begins in 1865 and travels through the year 1951. During this time, the Apaches went from nomadic, horse-mounted raiders and hunters to wide-eyed prisoners of war and residents of reservations, and then to proud independent people making their own way in the white man's world. This is a story that's considered the truth told along with fiction in a time when the Apache way of life was being threatened by the overtaking of Americans who were migrating west and the terrors on the dark side in this life, witches and other evil spirits in the flesh that still had to be destroyed to enter the next life unscathed. Michael, welcome again to Native Chalk Talk.
It's really my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having
Awesome.
me.
Absolutely. So I enjoyed working with you on season 3, episode 8, when we discussed the life and times of Geronimo. And you've done extensive research on the Apache. And when I read this trilogy, I found myself having so many aha moments. You know, we've seen all the cowboys and Indian shows and movies that are primarily focused on the white folks' characters. And often there's just natives coming in and out of the woodwork to attack the settlers, but there's no story behind why they're attacking usually and no explanation of the culture. So what I really enjoyed about these books is they're a historical fiction story about the Apaches and culture and mission, and the non-natives are the ones that come in and out of the picture. So the roles are kind of reversed, which I thought was interesting. So we get to experience more of the why and how and backstories around the lives of the tribe. And in these episodes, listeners, you'll hear a historical fiction story, but you'll also learn a lot about the Mescalero Apache. A disclaimer for our listeners today, these books and these episodes do contain realistic depictions of historic actions and events that do include violence. They're certainly not G-rated, so listener discretion is advised. Before we get started on our story, I have a few questions. First off, most people know the Apache as the Apache, but listeners will hear us talk about the Mescalero Apache. Would you help us understand? There's the Eastern and Western Apache, correct?
Sure. The best way that I have found to think about Apache bands is to use the Rio Grande as the primary dividing line between the Eastern and the Western Apaches. By the time of this story, the Comanche, Kiowa, and Kiowa Apaches had driven the Plains Apaches, with a few notable exceptions, west of the Pecos River, which formed the Pecos formed the eastern boundary for the Eastern Apaches. Between these two rivers were the Jicarilla Apaches, the Mescaleros, and often the Lipans, who are considered Eastern Apaches. West of the Rio Grande were the Membranos, also known as the Kahini or Warm Spring Apaches, and they live mainly in New Mexico on the other side of the Membrano Mountains, also known as the Black Range. And past the Black Range were the Chiricahua that included the Betakoi, who was a small band. It was Geronimo's original band. The Chokonen, which were Cochise's people, and the Nedni to the south, who lived mostly in Mexico and were led in the times of this story by a great war chief named Whoa. And the Western Apache, even further to the west, that included the Arrivapai, the White Mountains, the Cibacue, the San Carlos, and the Tontos. And this is all really a somewhat of an arbitrary set of names that the Mexicans gave to those various bands, but they've kind of stuck over the last couple of centuries.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting for listeners who may have sometimes they'll hear White Mountain Apache or they'll hear the Chiricahua Apache. And I know for me, sometimes I've gotten mixed up as to wait, how was the association there? But this makes so much more sense when you put it plainly like this for us. So, how influential were the Mexicans on the Apache, you think?
Well, the primary influence that the Mexicans had on the Apaches were the weapons and their whiskey making ability, and the Apaches loved to raid the Mexicans for food and supplies. That was, but they and I should say that they were fond of stealing their children to raise as Apaches.
You're fond of stealing their children. Yeah, yeah. Because I noticed that a lot of the characters, both fictional and historical, some of them are, say, Apache, but they have kind of Hispanic sounding names. So it seems like there's kind of like as with anything, there was kind of a meddling of the two cultures together a little bit, right?
Yeah, the Apaches were actually proud of those Mexican names, because it meant that they had so frightened the people that they were raiding that they could pick out the individual raiders and refer to them by a given name. And so for an Apache, a Mexican name like Geronimo was a badge of honor. And it wasn't bad at all. In fact, in Geronimo's prime, his own people called it Geronimo.
Interesting. So I mentioned these books are based on a true story. Who is the story based on?
It's in this book a child named Henry Fountain, who in 1896 in New Mexico territory faced a tragedy in his life. He saw his father murdered, and as far as the record goes, disappeared, never to be found after his father was murdered. Although about half the country was looking for him. And I might also mention that his father vanished too, but there was just too much blood around the place where they turned off the road that the territory at least was certain that he had been murdered.
Wow. Yeah, no surprise there then. So I'll stop there about Henry since I don't want to give away too many spoilers. Listeners are probably Googling Henry Fountain right now, but and how is Henry Fountain's story preserved? Was his story a legend passed around through the generations, or did he write a book about his life, or what?
Well, he wrote down the story of his life in the way I tell the tale, in journals. And after he was finished, he read it back to his mentor and close friend Yellow Boy, and decided that he needed to write down Yellow Boy's story also. And so they spent months on weekends when he came up from Las Cruces to have Yellow Boy tell him what happened in his life.
If only we had had native Chalk Talk back then.
Yeah,
Just...
that would have simplified things considerably.
Absolutely. I'm all about that preservation, but at least he did record that he had the foresight to go, I need to write this down. That's really cool. So many of our characters in this book are based on real people and their stories, such as the Apache Chiefs and the American Scouts and some others. And I like in the beginning of the book, you've listed a sort of glossary of Apache words and meanings that are used throughout, as well as the names of the characters. So the readers can easily refer back to that information. And I referred back several times, so thank you. So the name of our character, Yellow Boy, is named after a certain object that most people are familiar with, but I won't spoil the meaning for those who don't know what it is yet, and you'll find out later, I promise. There's also a handy dandy map that I'll post on my Native Chalk Talk Facebook page so listeners can get a sense of where these events took place. By the way, listeners, in order to fit everything into each episode, I've significantly reduced the details from the books. I've left out some super dramatic details that you have to get the books to experience. So do go out and get them for yourself. Trust me, you'll thank me later. They also make good gifts too. So these episodes will be a bit different than my typical Native Chalk Talk shows. So sit back and enjoy story time as Michael and I share the fascinating and at times heart-pounding stories of Yellow Boy and of his tribe, the Mescalero Apache. This book is from the perspective of Yellow Boy, so when you hear quotes with the words I or me, for instance, you'll know it's Yellow Boy who's speaking. So where does Yellow Boy's story begin, Michael?
Well, it starts at Bosque Redondo, New Mexico territory, the 30th of October, 1865. Bosque Redondo had started out basically as a reservation for the Mescalero Apaches, but after Kit Carson conquered the Navajo and sent them on that long, desperate march to Bosque Redondo, it became very, very crowded, and so the Rio Pecos made an almost circular loop around a big stand of trees, and hence the place was called Round Woods, or Bosque Redondo in Spanish. The Rio Pecos had a high alkali content. I think it may still, if you get up north of Bosque Redondo, but it was the primary source of water. If you drank from it, it could make you sick.
Oh.
There was a good swath of farmland for field and garden crops, and the Mescaleros spent most of the first year digging irrigation ditches to water their field crops, and the field return from that first crop was really good. But after that, their crops were destroyed by everything from frost to insects to hail to wind. Mm. And it was so bad that the Navajo, after they saw what was happening to those crops, and they were forced on the same land as the Apaches, thought that the land was cursed and didn't even attempt to plant crops.
Wow.
The Mescaleros had been told Bosque Redondo would be their reservation. But then when the thousands of Navajo who surrendered to Kit Carson came as POWs to Bosque Redondo, they just didn't have the resources to support that many people. By 1865, when Yellow Boy was about 5 years old, the women were being taken by a wagon about 18 miles out into the llano to dig up mesquite roots for firewood. Carlton wouldn't even let the Mescaleros hunt or harvest desert plants, which the Apaches were fond of eating for food. And by 1865, the Army couldn't provide the starving Apaches and the Navajos a quarter of what they had been promised as rations. And it's really kind of understandable. It was the end of the Civil War. The South was on its knees. Its people were starving. Washington looked west and saw this group of Aboriginal people living out in the wilderness. And so who do you think got the food?
Yeah.
Cadete told the post commanders several times that if the Apaches would leave if conditions didn't improve. They didn't, and the Apaches left. 500 in one night. And they were sitting right next to Fort Sumner, which had a large number of soldiers there to guard them.
So, side note, the Mescalero Apaches are known as the people of the woods, right?
Yeah, they call themselves the Shishinde, which means people of the woods.
That's why is that? Because I don't picture that area where they were as wooded very much, right?
Well, the Mescaleros actually lived in the Sacramento Mountains after they got driven off of the plains, and that's a very forested area, and they were happy to be there until the cavalry and army troops came along to conquer them and run them off.
Okay, that makes a whole lot more sense now. Listener. Okay, so at this point in time, the White Eyes or non-natives were holding the Mescalero Apache as prisoners of war on the Bosque Redondo reservation. And when Yellow Boy was only 5 years old, a chief came to speak with his father, whose name was Caballo Negro, which means black horse. By the way, Yellow Boy at the time was called Ishkene, which means boy, and his true name had not been given to him yet, which is a common act among many tribes who would give their children their long-term names later in their lives. Anyway, during a meeting in the Ragged Family teepee, the chief and Yellow Boy's father talked in a hushed tone about how the Mescalero Apache were crafting a plan to leave Bosque Redondo. So what was the plan according to Yellow Boy's dad?
Well, Caballo Negro told his wife and Ishkene after Cadete left the teepee that first of all, they were all going to leave on the same night. They were all going to go in small groups in many different directions. So the army had to choose which ones they would go after, and the rest would surely get away. And as the book has Caballo Negro saying, when we leave, families will go in small groups in many different directions. Cadete says it's best to go south to the camp of Cha, the brother of Cadete, Santana, and Roman. With Cha, I can raid the Naki'i villages and ranches along the Great River and the wagons on the Inda Road. The Caballo Negro will be a man again, a warrior, not a slave. He frowned and stared at us so we would not forget what he said next. There are Inda spies in the camp. Don't speak of leaving to anyone. A spy hears you and we'll have to fight our way out rather than slip away.
So there are spies, so they need to look out. Now the Inda, what are the Inda?
The Inda are basically anybody that are not Apaches, and they usually referred to Inda as the whites because there were so many of them. They actually called themselves Inde, which means dead, because the Inda whites, which were living, Indi means life or living, were able to so overrun their land that the Apaches really weren't wild and free like they were at one time, and so they considered themselves dead, and that's what really made a difference for them.
So Inde and Inda, two different
Right.
things. And we
Right.
can think of Inda probably the easiest as being the white folks. So why did the Apache want to leave that reservation?
Well, let me quote from the book again. And again, this is Caballo Negro talking with his wife, Sansirie, and his son Ishkane. He says, now the Indi tell us where we can go and when. They won't even let us hunt. They give us less and less to eat. The Indi made us give our land to the Navajos after we worked like slaves digging ditches for water and planting seeds, though we were here first. The meat the Indi give us is no good. It makes us sick. The blankets we are given are thin and cold, not thick and warm, like those of the Indi or the Nakies, i.e. the Mexicans.
There's some bitterness there that they've given their land to the Navajo. And so did the Apache and the Navajo at that time, did they cross paths very much?
Not really. They were actually, according to ethnologists, they're about first cousins. An Apache can hear a Navajo speak, and he can pretty much understand everything that's said. That's because they both speak from a root language, Athabascan. However, when they got down to the nitty gritty, the Navajos thought of themselves as free raiders, and that was one reason why Kit Carson went after them. They were stealing a lot of the property from the Apaches, and so they had some really pretty fierce battles in those days. You can read about them in the book by Cremoni. I think it's called The Apache.
Oh, pretty easy then. And what's
Yeah.
the author's name again?
Cremoni,
Cremoni.
Cremony.
Okay. Very interesting. So the time came for the Mescalero to leave. Yellow Boy was awakened in the teepee by his mother in the early morning hours. And the book reads, it was dark and cold, and the air was filled with much dust and the sounds of many shuffling feet and horses and mules snorting and stamping their hoofs. Why don't we ride the horses instead of running? She, his mother, whispered, they're too weak to go far if we ride. For 3 or 4 days, they must have their fill of grass and only carry a little weight. Then they'll be strong enough to ride. Now you must be very quiet until your father returns. If the bluecoats hear us, they'll try to chase us back or kill us if we fight. It's pretty heavy stuff to have to tell a child. So during the second night of running, the family headed south toward the camp of Cha. The moon had barely moved when Caballo Negro held up his hand for us to stop. He tied off the horses in a small grove of piñons, took me down, and spoke to my mother and me in a low voice. What did his father say?
Do you smell the wood smoke? The wagon tracks in front of us say maybe there's a ranch on the other side of the ridge. A ranch means horses and food. Maybe I can take some and we will run no more, eh, woman? Caballo Negro took his bow and quiver of arrows and disappeared into the night, running up the ridge. We heard a small pop in the distance, a rifle shot, and then another and another. A woman screamed. I thought at first it was the cougar's war cry, like we sometimes heard near Bosque Redondo. But soon I understood it was a woman's cry of fear. There was another pop, and then no more. We heard horses running across the ridge before we saw Caballo Negro in the moonlight. He led 6 horses and rode with a saddle on the 7th one. A large feed sack filled with supplies and several blankets rolled and tied on the back of the saddle. He rode up to my mother and me and slid off the saddle, smiling. "Woman, we will no longer shiver under the thin blankets, and we will ride fast and far. These are good, strong ponies. I killed him with 2 arrows. Then his woman came out screaming, trying to take the rifle and shoot some more. She looked weak and sick. I decided she would not last as a slave for you, so I killed her with another arrow. I took only the best horses from the corral and left the others. With those horses left in the corral, it might take a while for other white eyes to realize the ranch didn't accidentally catch on fire. Maybe the Indi will never understand this was an Apache raid."
First off, I love that he calls her woman, but you never want to take a weak and sick woman along, so decides to kill her
Yeah,
instead, you know.
they were eminently practical.
Very much so. And I think it's a good time to point out here that it was kill or be killed. The well-being of your family and your tribe, that was all that mattered at any cost. And so anyway, that's interesting. So as the days and travel went on, the family was joined by another family from the tribe, and there was a sense of happiness that Yellow Boy would have friends to play with. And then they came upon the Mescalero chief named Cha.
Yeah, the path they were taking led up into the Guadalupe Mountains, which are right on the border between Texas and New Mexico, and about 100 miles east of El Paso. And when they finally found Cha, Yellow Boy said, upon seeing Cha, Caballo Negro said, "Diante, Cha, brother of Santana, Roman, and Cadete. I am the warrior Caballo Negro. We ask to join you. We've suffered many seasons at the hands of the Indi at the place on the river to the east and north called Bosque Redondo. All Mescaleros at the Bosque left there for 5 suns ago. The bluecoats do not follow. Cadete goes to Santana. He said you wanted more warriors. Do you want us, or must we move on?"
Thankfully, Cha generously welcomed the Mescalero, and 2 boys near Yellow Boy's age were new friends, Ka, which means arrow, and Kodo, or firefly. The family also met a couple that would make an impact on their lives. Your book says an older couple, he watches, and his wife, Socorro, sheltered and fed us as if we were invited guests. Cha's people had given Socorro her name because she knew how to take corn and make the best tiswin of anyone in the band. Tiswin is a weak beer. So he watches, and Socorro asked Caballo Negro if they might adopt Sonsi Are as their daughter and thereby attach his family to their lodge. So basically, they became Yellow Boy's grandparents. He watches often rode a big red mule stolen in El Paso up the steep path to the ridge top where he watched the wagon road for dust plumes in the far bright distance, telling of new supplies coming or more bluecoats coming for his warriors to kill for rifles and ammunition. So after he studied a dust plume, sometimes for hours, with a brass telescope he called Shina Cho, or Big Eye, he sent a boy running back to camp with word that supplies and booty were coming for the taking. Yellow Boy was growing, and his dad and he watches decides it's time for him to use a bow and arrow. So tell us what they taught him.
Well, they gave him a bow, and he watches also gave him his first knife, which I think he carried all his days. But after these gifts were given to him, his father had a heart-to-heart talk with him, and he said, "In hunting, you must go very carefully and make no noise with your feet against stones or grass. Like the cougar, you must move slyly, carefully, and with much patience. Rise before tomorrow's sun comes. Run. Do this every day. Begin by running to the bottom of the canyon trail before you return.
I
And
loved
so,
this part because it was there's a lot more to it that I cut out, a ton of details I cut out where they were working with him and giving him good advice and telling him how to, if he had to stand somewhere for hours or sit there for hours waiting for the right timing for to kill his prey or to do a raid, then that's what he must do. There's so much of that good stuff in the book, so you guys just have to get the book to read all of that. Well, the time came for the younger boys to prove their place as future warriors. So Yellow Boy, his father, Caballo Negro, and 5 other men and their sons came together for this trial. Caballo Negro said, "You who now take this long journey do well learning how to fight, hunt, and make war. You want to become warriors, prove you are men. In this trial, prove your skill and stamina, and you will come with us as apprentices. The fastest among you might finish this run in 4, maybe 5 suns. Eat nothing, drink only water for the first 2 suns, and after 2 suns, eat whatever you can catch or find. Follow your pony's path back to the camp, run only at night. Hide and rest in the day. Each warrior knows where to start his son. We ride." So Caballo Negro speaks to Ishkane, where he's left nearly 100 miles from home to find his way back. And so he watches, says to Ishkane, "Return from this trial, and your name will become Nakayen," which means keen-sighted. So this was the new name he would take on as a mature young man. So true to his word, Caballo Negro left me an easy to follow trail even in the dark. I followed it across rough country filled with brushy flats, deep arroyos, and rolling hills with flat tops covered with grama grass, mesquite, yucca, and creosote bushes. Nakayen does as he's told and sleeps hid away from a nearby water hole during the day. When the sun was passing halfway from the top of its arc into the edge of night, my heart began to pound. At the bottom of the hill, 2 Indas, the white men, in trader clothes, and a blue coat soldier sat on their horses studying the trail left by Caballo Negro and talking among themselves. One of the Inda led a mule loaded with supplies. Tied across the pack frame along with the supplies was my friend Ka, one of the other boys running home. So, Michael, in the next few paragraphs coming up, I realized how alarming this whole test was. It was no joke. And these young boys were put out there to face whatever came at them, and they could have died. So, again, a point in the world that it was kill or be killed. You become the best of the best at survival, or you will die. And you'd better learn it young because they're putting you out there young too, right?
yeah, that's all true. The test was, they lived in the Guadalupe Mountains, and their fathers put them on a horse, carried them south 100 miles to the Davis Mountains, and there they put them off at different spots, and their job was to be able to get back on their own over that 100 miles. And naturally, the fathers try to make it easy for them by leaving a nice little horse trail for them to follow back. And that was what was happening with Yellow Boy and Caballo Negro. Now, the purpose of the test was to demonstrate that the boys could find their way back home if they got separated from the warriors who were taking them on raids as novitiates. They had to remember the shape of the mountain range outline as they went home, where the water holes were, and how to live off the land. If they couldn't do that, they weren't any use to the fighting men and would quickly be taken prisoner or die. And so that was the way it was. You had to prove yourself that you were ready to serve the warriors 4 times, and then maybe they might let you go out as a full-blown warrior.
And of course, there was honor in that too. It wasn't just about, I would look at that and go, "No, thanks, I'm okay. Just let me stay back with the women and stuff." But for them, they were itching to do this. This was part of their manhood, part of their respect that they would get from their tribe.
Yeah, it's interesting that the girls after the Apache children reached about 8 or 9 years old, maybe 10, the girls and the boys separated. They didn't play together anymore.
Oh, really?
And a girl knew that she had become a woman at her first menarche. And that was absolutely a great moment for the Apaches, because it meant a woman had come into their midst who could bear children for them. The boys, on the other hand, didn't really have anything like that, and so they had to prove themselves in raids and in wars. And so when I'll call him Naki found and freed his friend from the blue coat and white eye scouts, he says he tells how he did it. He says, I crept close enough to the dying fire to see two bodies wrapped in blankets lying near it, and Ka with no blanket, his hands tied behind him, the end of the rope running from his hands, tying his feet together, and then to the tall scout who wrapped it around his wrist. The blue coat snoring nearby. So Yellow Boy looks for the third white eye, the third end eye, and he finds him out close to where the mule is grazing, and he attacks the scout after he thought the mule had wandered away. And Yellow Boy says, I'm not sure he even saw me rise off the ground like a shadow before I stuck the point of my long blade into his windpipe and slashed to the right. He opened his mouth to scream, but only gurgled, drowning in his own blood as he collapsed, sitting down and then falling backwards, his head barely attached to his body. I felt the drops of warm blood shower my face and body. I had killed my first man. With the night and the surprise on my side, it had been easy. However, I felt no joy in killing the scout. Rather, it was more relief that now I had only two others with whom to deal. And so he creeps back to the camp to take care of the other scout in the blue coat. And the blue coat continued to snore, his right hand resting on his revolver. The scout's blankets were thrown aside. He was nowhere in sight, and his weapons were gone. I froze. A few yards away, I heard a cough, and the tall scout hawked phlegm and spat. Like wind, I was at the blue coat's blankets. His eyes fluttered open, but I was too quick for him and quickly cut his throat. At the fire, the scout checked the knots on the rope holding Cobb before he crawled under his blanket and pulled his big revolver to hold against his chest before he lay back. Cobb was watching him and saw me come. I killed the big scout as I had the blue coat, this time Cobb looking on and smiling. He found his knife sheathed in the belt of the tall Linda and pulled the clothes from the body as I washed the blood spatters from my face and hands and arms with sand. We needed to get the blood off our bodies because when the sun came up and the blood had warmed, it would stink and call Buzzard to follow us, a sure pointer for prying eyes.
Okay, do y'all see what I mean? I mean, this is hardcore stuff. I mean, how old was Yellow Boy even at this point?
He was about 16.
Okay, still pretty young, but oh my God. I can't imagine as a mom sending my son out to try to become a warrior. It would just, oh man. You have to hope you have a girl back then, I guess. So,
Well, in the Apache culture, Girls were usually considered at least as important as the boys, and maybe more so, because they were the producers of the tribe.
Yeah, right. Wow. So thankfully he finds Kaw, and I bet Kaw was good to see him. It says, as I cut the ropes binding him, Kaw shook his head. I'm a fool. I didn't do what my father told me, and I ran in the daytime. I thought if I returned first, no one would care if I had disobeyed his instructions. After running north and riding the White Eye horses, Yellow Boy and Kaw returned to camp, excited to tell the story of how he had killed 3 Inda with a knife and rescued his friend. His father was proud and gave him a new name, Nakayen. However, I'll continue to call him Yellow Boy for uniformity's sake, and you'll see why I call him Yellow Boy later on. So, something that was pretty common with a lot of tribes, as with the Apache, was raids. Tell us about the raids and why they typically did them.
Well, Apache raids were different than Apache war. Raids were made for food and other supplies, and it was really rare that they killed anyone on a raid because they wanted the victims to prosper in the next growing season so they could come back again and get a good supply of food.
Mm.
War was different. It was usually done out of revenge or self-defense, and it was rare that people didn't die.
Yeah, that makes sense. And now Yellow Boy will face his first raid. He watches noticed freight wagons drawn by mules stirring up the dust along the White Eye Road running from San Antonio to El Paso. So why don't you read to us about that raid?
Okay, just a little background. They had picked out a part of the trail that ran between 2 hills, and on each hill they were going to have men shooting, but they also planted a series of shooters down next to the road, and they dug pits to hide in and covered up with blankets. The Apaches very rarely fought an enemy or did a raid head on. It was always from ambush. And so the book reads, before dawn, our raiding party left the camp by 2s and 3s and rode out of the mountains and down many scattered trails through the llano brush to avoid raising dust plumes that might warn approaching freighters. The Apaches set up an ambush for the freighters in one day. Early the next day, they prepared to attack. Caballo Negro had taught me to put stripes of black charcoal powder mixed with a little fat under my eyes and across the bridge of my nose to lessen the glare. And this lesson, like so many others, had become a second nature, ingrained as part of the ritual preparation for a raid. Down the road in the shimmering distance, dust, the kind wagons made, rose high in the still shimmering air. Now, as part of the ambush, Yellow Boy was to hide in the brush along the road and help kill the wagon drivers and guards with his bow and arrows. He had not been on raid before and didn't yet have a firearm. And he says, my heart thumping, I pulled my bow from its sheath and rising to my knees, strung it. I pulled 4 arrows tipped with iron points from my quiver, checked each point, laid 1 arrow across the bow, and held the others under the fingers of my left hand, gripping the bow's handle. The wagons arrive at the ambush site, and the warriors begin taking care of business. I bent my bow to my arm's full length, and the sinew bindings around the arrowhead rough, rubbing the top of my forefinger. I made a small step to the right for a clear shot and paused to steady my body and released the arrow, the whispering bowstring slapping my wrist protector and a solid snapping sound. The arrow streaked forward straight and true, striking the outrider with a solid thump a little below his armpit. slicing through his chest and punching through to the other side, the arrowhead pinning his arm to his side, making no sound, limp and empty like a drained water bladder. The rider slumped off his horse, dead, before he hit the sand. Warriors sprang out of the pits next to the road, firing rifles and bows. They killed the lead mule, starting to race forward, and then turned their fire on the wagon drivers, who were frantically trying to make the mules run forward. But the mules were balking, smelling the blood of their brothers, confused by the roar and smoke of rifles and screams of the Apaches running for them. I sent arrows into two of the drivers. Deadly fire poured into the wagons, leaving big, splintered-filled holes with bullets passing through the wagon boxes, where a few surviving drivers and their passengers took shelter before they died, hiding behind the wood. Only one man left the wagons. He desperately tried to run back down the road until he collapsed on the arroyo bank against its light brown sand. Bloody wounds scattered across his back. I saw an Inda rise from the third wagon, sight his rifle, and fire at Caballo Negro. Continuing to sight the rifle in place, the shooter, in the space of half a breath, levered another round, but before he pulled the trigger, my arrow struck him in the side of his head. His eyes bulged as life left him like a startled bird taking wing. His hands froze around his rifle, and he fell backwards across the wagon seat. Caballo Negro shook his rifle toward me in thanks. The warriors walked among the Indas, ready to cut throats of those still alive. The wagon train had been hauling supplies such as I had seen in trading posts and stores in the land of the Nakies. There were bolts of cloth, canned goods, sweet candy, tobacco, grain, and many heavy pieces of iron tools used to scratch in gardens made in this hard, dusty land. The warriors loaded the mules with all the supplies they could carry.
Man, that was intense. And now we have a special moment in the story. Yellow Boy's father found a rifle among the spoils, and the rifle's lever fit into a yellow, or what some may call gold, medal. So a Comanche had carried a rifle like this and called it Yellow Boy. So, hold on to that thought, listeners. Yellow Boy. So the book goes on to say, we left the dead Inda naked and smeared with blood where they fell. After taunts by Cha and a few other warriors that they didn't have stomachs to be warriors, Ka and Kodo mutilated several bodies. Caballo Negro watched, shook his head, and said to me, never do that unless there is a useful purpose. Men enter the land of the grandfathers carrying only the marks of their death, not the way their bodies are butchered after their ghosts leave. Only weak men do such things to please themselves. Ghosts of the dead repay disrespect. It is an evil thing to suffer the dead's revenge. Cha makes a mistake teaching Ka and Kodo to do this. Remember what I tell you. Was either one of those typically the Apache way to respect the dead, or on the other hand, to disrespect the dead by taunting their bodies?
Well, depending on the tribe, but the Mescaleros in particular didn't like to handle the dead. They believed that all kinds of bad things could happen to them, like something they called ghost sickness, where the ghost of the deceased came back and really did bad things to them. If they did handle a body, if a body was mutilated, those doing it knew they were taking a big risk, and usually did it only out of revenge. Torture was another thing. It was done to the living, often in hopes of finding a worthy enemy.
Okay, interesting. I mean, that's something I didn't know about the Apache. And of course, the men upon returning were greeted with songs as they brought the new goods to the camp, followed by victory dancing and drumming. And the book goes on to say, the fierce dance began. When a man's name was called, he left the group of the dancers, moved into the open space closer to the fire, and danced alone, reenacting his bravery in the raid. Then, before returning to the warriors in the dance, he left the circle of light and returned with what he would give away. He put the gifts on the east side of the fire opposite the drummers and singers and told the people to help themselves. I left the men in the outer circle of warriors to dance next to the fire in its brightest orange and yellow light, my feet pounding the dust and pulling an imaginary bow and making the worst war face as I released my arrows. As a new shift of drummers took up the beat, the men left the circle and sat down, and a new dance began, the wheel dance. Single women formed in pairs and made a spoke wheel rotating east to west around the fire. Once the wheel was turning, each pair of women took turns leaving the fire to tap the men they wanted for dancing partners. Obviously, all eyes are now on Yellow Boy, who again at the time they were calling Nakayen. He spots Deer Woman, named because of her large doe-like eyes, who he's had on his mind for a very long time. And she was hanging out with a girl named Juanita. And those two had shared the same hahe ceremony 2 years earlier. So tell us about the hahe.
Well, the hahe was a big 4-day ceremony the Mescaleros used to celebrate the arrival of a new woman. The girl had her menarche, and the possibility of more children added to the band. It was a big thing. They made a huge teepee out of 4 trees that they leaned together. They usually had 3 or 4 medicine men doing the ceremonies, and as I say, it lasted 4 days. The last day, the girl of the ceremony became someone that, depending on the tribe, was called White Painted Woman. And her spirit is said to, or was thought to ascend to the heavens to be with Usin, the great Apache creator god, for the day, and she could bestow his blessings on others who asked for them during the time of her ascent. When the hahe was complete, the girl was assumed ready for marriage, but it was her choice to make, and most waited until they were 15 to 20 years of age.
That's what I was going to ask you next, what the typical age was for marriage. So, okay, older than I thought.
It was not unusual for a 13 or 14-year-old girl to marry, especially if she was physically well developed. But it was really pretty rare.
Yeah. Well, this ceremony makes it all seem fun. I don't think most women get to have those kinds of ceremonies, but anyway, I'll digress on that. So, as they're doing the wheel dance, Yellow Boy spots Deer Woman smiling at him. He got ready to stand once she came towards him to tap his shoulder. But instead of tapping him, she walks right past him to an older boy named Delgadito. So yeah, she really she disses Yellow Boy. It's so sad. But lo and behold, he feels a tapping on his shoulder, and it's Juanita. And so begins their love story. Although I don't know if love story is really the way to describe it. I mean, pairing up with a mate was much more about survival back then than about love, right?
Yeah, the Apache view of marriage was that it was a partnership, and each partner had their specific duties, and neither could survive without the other. The man was clearly in charge, but he consulted closely with his wife if he thought her wise and knowledgeable about something that required a decision. In Apache culture, respect for your partner was more important than love. Love was often a part of a marriage relationship, but not unusual if it was not. Survival and children were the most important things in life, but survival always came first. And there are stories and records where Apaches with women and who had babies had to get away from the cavalry or the soldiers, and they couldn't do that if a baby cried, so they killed them. They just flat choked them.
They would kill their own children?
Yep, they would
Oh my
if they
God.
didn't if they weren't developed enough to know to be quiet. Then
Oh my God.
they couldn't risk carrying them with them, and they could leave them behind, but they knew that if they did, they would wind up probably being slaves. And some of the mothers actually killed their own children because they couldn't bear the idea of a child being a slave to an Indian.
So in a sense, it was a bit of mercy. They thought they were doing what was best for the child, like when a horse breaks its leg and then you kill the horse. Not that children are horses, but
Yeah.
back then, again, it's all about survival and doing what's best for the tribe.
I use the word cavalry interchangeably with soldiers, but in fact, there were a lot of foot soldiers there in the Apache Wars.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So thank you for sharing that. So that night, as Yellow Boy thought about the dance and being rejected by Dear Woman, he thought about her choice, Delgadito. He thought Delgadito was not reluctant to tell stories about the Mexican women he took, often brutally, after raids across the Great River. Shame, shame. Sounds like we need to keep an eye on Delgadito. Anyway, so Yellow Boy's dad tells him to tell Juanita his intentions after a season. He also warns him to stay out of the bushes with her and to be a man of honor. Good dad advice. But then he tells Yellow Boy a little something about Delgadito. What does he say?
In their talk about Delgadito and Dear Woman, Caballo Negro told Yellow Boy, he talked to your friend from your boyhood days, Dear Woman, into the bushes the other night after they danced. Sons Na and his wife drank too much Tiswin to watch her. She was eager like a mare in heat and didn't take much convincing. I hear Delgadito laughs with his friends and says, Dear Woman expects he will marry her now because she wore him out in the bushes. Maybe wife number 2, but not the first ever, he says.
Dang, stay away from those bushes, y'all. The bushes. Wow. So, my oh my, how the plot thickens. So, there's actually a lot more to that story with Delgadito and Dear Woman. So, listeners, go grab the book to find out the details. It's super juicy. But big news, y'all. One of my favorite Choctaw authors, Sarah Elizabeth Sawyer, has a new writing course called Fiction Writing American Indians. This course is going to show you how to discover the insight you need to write quality, authentic stories, learn practical approaches to researching Native cultures, and get answers to hard questions. I'll be taking the same course, so I invite you to take it with me. Just go to americanindians.fictioncourses.com. But don't forget to use the code CHOCTALK, CHOCTALK, when you're checking out so you can get $30 off. Yep, you're welcome. Learning stuff and saving money. Let's do this. So Caballo Negro soon has a big surprise. Yellow Boy says, I looked up in sunrise and my heart raced as if I were still running when Caballo Negro handed me the Yellow Boy rifle and the long-barreled revolver still in its holster that he had taken from the wagon train. His dad then takes him to learn to shoot the rifle, but Yellow Boy wasn't exactly a natural at shooting like he was at becoming a warrior. So Caballo Negro decides to send him off to learn how to shoot from a man named Rufus Peak. He introduces Yellow Boy and he watches to Rufus, and then the book reads, Rufus Pike nodded towards us and said in Spanish something like, howdy, boys, get off them stolen ponies and sit a spell. I'll whip us something to eat here in a bit. And I love that when I read it because I know that a lot of times back then there was a lot of stealing of horses. So Get off those stolen ponies. So Caballo Negro asks Rufus to teach his son to shoot, to which he asks, "What's in it for me?" You do this, Rufus Peak. You teach Nakayen to shoot the yellow boy rifle fast and straight, close and far, and I'll never come for you. I'll no longer claim rights of trial with you. The Apaches will never raid or attack Rufus Peak if you give water for horses and meat for the trail. Rufus said, "Come back in 3 moons and he'll be shooting good as he can, and he'll know enough to live with the Indas." So over time, Yellow Boy greatly improved. They also had meaningful conversations, and Rufus became a mentor to him, even teaching him bits of Spanish and English. And at one point, he asks Rufus a question about going to the reservation. Feel free to talk through that conversation.
Well, uh, Yellow Boy really learned a lot from Rufus Pike, not just the basics of shooting, but how to deal with the white eyes. And one of the questions that they talked about was this question about reservations. Why did the Apaches have to put up with the reservations? And so the conversation, as recorded in the book, goes something like this. Yellow Boy speaks. Rufus Pike, another question. Sure, ask it. This reservation the Indas make for Mescaleros, why must we go there? Rufus spat off the side of the porch and frowned with clenched teeth. You need to go for your own protection. There's not many Indas for you. There's too many Indas for you to fight. For every 100 Indas you kill, there's 10,000 to take their place. I know it ain't right for us Americans to come here and just claim the land, but we did. And before that, the Spaniards did too. You want your people to live through more than 1 or 2 generations without your tribe disappearing forever? That's the life you got to accept. Life on the reservation and the end of war and raiding. That there is what I think.
And this is a heart-wrenching conversation and very telling of the times. They could perhaps hold off the inevitable for a bit, but only for so long, because not even a rifle for every Apache could ward off the endless amount of white men that would be coming. An important moment was about to come to Yellow Boy. The book reads the following from his perspective as he remembers a dream. It was dark. I was running hard, running for a long time. Thunder spoke and lightning flashed, and the point of light stretched into a slowly tumbling bar with a golden center until it formed the Yellow Boy. Wind moaned in a roaring rush, and a voice said, "In 2 days, go to the top of the first mountain above Rufus Pike's Canyon. Take only the Yellow Boy. Go, and you will save yourself and protect your people." And so after waking from this dream, Yellow Boy heads off to the mountains with the purpose of finding his power. Here's what happened. I dimly saw gray, billowing clouds building to the southwest and smiled, my dry lips cracking. I thought, at last they come. The Thunder People and Wind were coming to take me or bless me with my power. The clouds rolled towards me like great running horses. The storm spirits riding them came shouting and shooting their brilliant, blinding arrows into the ground and between clouds. The voice of Wind came in 1,000 whispers, came in myriad shrieks, filling my ears and pushing me backwards, trying to push me off my mountain, trying to kill me. I thought, this rifle is Yellow Boy, an extension of myself, its power part of me. Its power strikes wherever I look. It is part of my power. Instinctively, I grabbed and squeezed the rifle with both hands to avoid losing it in my blindness and recognition. Like an electric current flowed from the rifle up my arms and settled in the middle of my chest. My arms shook with the power of the current. When you confront a witch, shoot out its eyes, and it will become a blind ghost. Ghosts of blind witches cannot see you, cannot kill you, cannot harm you. You are Yellow Boy. You are killer of witches, their destroyer. Usan leaves you this gift. Do you accept it? From the center of my being, I cried into the storm. Yes, I accept it. Give me this gift. I will have it. and the voice was no more. And there it is. He is now officially deemed Yellow Boy, and he will soon be the killer of witches. So, as the sun lifted above the far horizon, I began my way back down the mountain, back to the house of Rufus Pike, back to my friend and mentor. So after this, Rufus takes Yellow Boy to practice shooting, and he shot better than ever before, precise and perfect. And I wanted to mention something you said earlier, how Rufus really becomes a mentor to him and trying to understand how to finagle the white man's world. And there's a story that I left out of here, but I can't help but say it. When Yellow Boy had gone to town and he saw someone with ammunition, and he is like, I'm just going to kill him and take his ammunition. And when Rufus finds out what he did, he's like, you can't do that. You're going to cause a war. Like, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I don't just raid it and take it when I want it. So I thought that was such a telling part of that kind of transition from the way they had been doing things to now having to live in this world that was being overtaken by the white man. So tell us what happened next. I had a hard time with this one and actually emailed you that night I read this section. So listeners, brace yourselves.
Well, a few days after his power came, Yellow Boy had another dream or vision that told him a witch would attack his people. When he got up, he told Rufus that he had to return to his people right away and save them from the witch in his dream. And the story here picks up as he's riding for Chaw's camp in the Guadalupe Mountains on the Texas-New Mexico border, about 100 miles east of El Paso. And he says, I saw no other riders on or near the Inda Road from the east. The fear of what I might find at Chaw's camp was like a ghost haunting me, driving me. I watched my eyes lied as I stared at what was left of it. I wished my eyes lied as I stared at what was left of the camp and felt the sour water from my gut rise in my throat. Bodies of children, women, warriors, and old ones lay scattered around the camp meadow and under the trees, some shot, some trampled, some with their throats cut, all scalped. I slid off my pony and desperately ran from body to body, hoping I would not find my family. But I found my father and never felt more helpless and in so dark a place in my life. I dragged through brush and fire. His body was so torn and scraped, I barely recognized him. His body showed many bullet wounds. I counted 5 in his front torso, 1 in the back, and 1 in his temple. The scalpers had included his ears, from which had hung a silver wire loop with curved turquoise horses in the left ear. When they scalped him, they had cut off his genitals and stuffed them in his mouth and ripped open his belly so his guts spilled out. Without his scalp, his face sagged into a nearly faceless mass, staring at the man who made me and taught me nearly everything I knew about the land, about hunting, about weapons, and about life. I swore in a cold, focused fury. It settled in my chest and burned there that the witch who did this to my father and our people would take many days to die, cursing the day of his birth, and enter the land of the grandfathers, blind forever.
No, I hated that part. You broke my heart. You're killing me, Michael. Oh, so, and unfortunately, this wasn't a rarity when it came to taking out the enemies back then. And this was a
Right.
typical means of dealing with enemies for some tribes back then, right?
Yeah, it was common with the Comanche and other plains tribes who believed by being so horrific and brutal that they would scare the white eyes away. That was usually the brunt of their killing and torture.
Hmm.
The Apaches rarely did things like that except for revenge or warning others away. Really daring ones might try to show their power by mutilating a body, but if they did, they knew they might get ghost sickness or disease their medicine men just couldn't cure.
That's so creepy. But again, another time, and this was very typical. So Yellow Boy goes on through the camp. I looked at the remains of everybody in the camp, but my mother, little brother, Socorro, he watches, and a few others I did not find. I swore to find them, swore to Usan to avenge this evil. I put my father back together as best I could, pulling his face back straight, tying his guts back together, and laying his genitals back where they belonged. I laid him on my horse blanket and wrapped and tied him in it. I strained to lift him, and the memory of how he had looked when I found him filled my throat with mesquite thorns. I carried him to a spot in the talus along the west side canyon wall, and laying his body there in a crack in the canyon wall, covered it with stones. The rest of the day I spent burying the other bodies under the rocks in the talus. He then gathers himself and leaves to find any survivors. He watches in his lookout spot. And of course, that was a joyous reunion. Yellow Boy asks He watches, "Tell me what happened." They roped him around his feet, and a giant with no hair, his body painted black and his head painted to look like a skull, dragged him back and forth through the camp, across fires, stones, and cactus, while shooting into the teepees, killing many. I hid there and watched what they did. I've never seen such evil. They were worse than the Comanches in the old days when we fought them. Across the Great River, Nakayes pay much for the Apache scalps. They even took Caballo Negro's hair with his ears and gave the scalp to the giant, who, I have no doubt, is a witch. Grandfather, what of the women and children not in the camp? Where are they? When they heard the shooting, they ran back to camp, but kept their heads and stayed out of sight until our enemies left. You must go and help them. He watches, looked in my eyes, and nodded. Now we go, Yellow Boy. They tracked the women, and where did they find them?
He watches and Yellow Boy, it concluded that they must be headed north toward Mescalero, which was just beginning as a reservation.
Hmm.
They soon found their trail and they followed it. And Yellow Boy, late in the afternoon, Yellow Boy speaks. I crept through the weeds and brush until I saw the other side of the bend where my pony stared. Two women, Juanita and her mother Maria, knives in hand, squatted behind a big boulder in the bottom of the arroyo. Yellow Boy and he watches surprise Maria and Juanita, who are relieved and thankful that Yellow Boy has come with he watches. And the book says Maria and Juanita led us to a small canyon out of the mountains that emptied into the arroyo. There, Maria stood in the middle of the wash and cupping her hands called like a gamble quail. From up the canyon, 5 children appeared from the brush as if they were quail. 8 haggard women followed them. That night, Yellow Boy keeps watch on top of the arroyo while the others rest below. And he says, I looked through the shinacho at the far glow of twinkling yellow light, a star fallen to the ground, and saw an Inda fire with men around it, men with big hats and big guns in their arms. Inda vaqueros watching cattle.
I won't give away too many spoilers here, but while Yellow Boy was keeping watch, Deer Woman comes creeping up on him and tries her Deer Woman ways. You'll have to read the book to find out what happens. So Yellow Boy now needs to go after the Inda for horses and supplies. He's searching for someone in their group who can use a sling. So Juanita steps up to the challenge, although Yellow Boy doubted her abilities. However, she showed him that she was highly skilled, and Yellow Boy describes that she looked at me with the fire still in her eyes and said, Women must be able to take care of themselves. Shall I show you what I can also do with a bow? You go, Juanita. So she sat down and turned her face from me to look with a faraway stare at Dear Woman. Dear Woman smiled no more and kept her eyes off of me. There's more to that story. It's so great. I love that whole part. Anyway, Yellow Boy and Juanita approached the Vaquero camp he had seen out on the Llano the night before. Llano is the prairie, right?
It's the dry prairie. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not desert, but it's not
Not really full of grass.
grassland either. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I motioned Juanita to work her way to the corral fence on the side opposite the guard. Her stone struck the vaquero in the back of his head, just below his sombrero brim. Juanita was quick over the corral bars and through the milling horses to reappear like a ghostly shadow at the rails near the gate. My aim with the bow was good, but the smoker was turning his head to say something to the meat cutter when the arrow hit him low and in the neck rather than in his throat where I had aimed. He grabbed the shaft and opened his mouth to yell when a stone struck his forehead and he fell back, silent and still. The meat cutter looked up, saw the smoker lying with an arrow in his neck, and opened his mouth to bellow in alarm when my arrow hit his windpipe. Clutching its shaft and gurgling blood, he began to stand up from his stool, but pitched forward into the fire. Hitting the bucket of cut meat made enough noise to rouse the napping vaqueros. Too late. The stone struck one man behind his right ear, and he fell over hard. His revolver clutched in the death grip, his eyes wide and frozen. The other three caught arrows in their hearts and fell back, their hands on the shafts and their bodies trembling in death. I ran forward, my knife drawn, ready to finish off any vaquero still living, but there was no need. Juanita strikes again. What a woman. Eventually, they get to the reservation where the agent, Fred Godfrey, smiling and nodding and with his arms widespread, welcomed our little group through an interpreter, although I understood nearly everything he said. He told us the great father in Washington wanted to help us, that we also should learn to help ourselves, and that we must swear never again to raid or take the warpath against the Inda. However, regardless of how glad to see us the agent seemed to be, I didn't trust him. There always seemed to be a lie lurking behind his eyes. Okay, so some shadiness is going on in the reservation. But I wanted to mention a little bit of a spoiler. In book 2, the guy that Juanita shot at might come back into the picture. So it's kind of interesting. All right, so tell us about the shadiness that was going on in the reservation.
Well, it was really outrageous. The agents were there to the Apaches, and this is generally true for most tribes there in the Southwest, were promised that if they just went and stayed on a reservation and didn't roam around, that the government would give them supplies and feed them. Well, as it turned out, the agents saw a golden opportunity to steal the government blind, starve the Indians, and make a lot of money, and that's exactly what Godfrey was into. In this story, he sends a wagon load of stolen supplies driven by two mescaleros who I'm sure knew what was going on, but they were just following his instructions to a warehouse that Godfrey had with another man in Las Cruces, which is all true. And eventually a Kahini Apache, who was the segundo, the number 2 for Victorio, but was really a crippled old man who, once he got on a horse, was quite the warrior. His name was Nane. And he was, as I say, Victorio's number 2, but he was also his son-in-law.
Oh,
and,
okay.
he brought 60 old people, a few women and children with him to the reservation and asked that he be allowed to stay there. And Godfrey welcomed them in. He was really happy to see them because more people there meant more supplies that he could steal. Nane was clever. He went into the reservation without the warriors who were riding with him, and he basically had them come over the ridge that was on the backside of the reservation, called that helped form a great canyon called the Rinconada, and Godfrey didn't have a clue that those warriors were there. They hunted as they needed and came and went as they pleased. A few months later, after Nane arrived, the two Mescalero men were making another drive with stolen supplies to the warehouse in Las Cruces. And suddenly, Nane's warriors appeared and stopped the wagon on the trail out of the mountains, told the Mescalero drivers to run back to the reservation, and took the wagon load of supplies back to the reservation and distributed them to the villages in which they were due. And of course, he kept a few for his people. Godfrey knew that if the settlers learned what he was doing, they'd want to hang him for giving the Mescaleros a good reason to go to war. And he pretty quickly took off and wasn't seen again by the Mescaleros.
Run away. Okay, so then Agent Godfrey is then replaced by Agent Russell, and he was just as bad as Godfrey, right?
Pretty much so. Although unlike Godfrey, who was flexible and adaptable to new situations on the reservation, Russell was a strictly by the book man, and it wound up getting a lot of people killed. He was a bureaucrat. And the army had been trying for nearly 2 years to get Victorio to settle on a reservation. And since Nane was already there, he came in and said he wanted to settle on the Mescalero reservation. Russell welcomed him, but he wouldn't give him and his men any supplies until some bureaucrat in the BIA said he could and transmitted it to him in writing. Well, how long can you go without supplies while you wait for some bureaucrat to give you permission to live, you know? So after a while, he left in a rage, and the border country went up in flames and killing. There's a funny tale about when Victorio left and went over to see Russell and wanted to know why he was doing this to him. And Russell, who had a long billy goat kind of beard, said, well, I'm just following the rules. And one of Victorio's men grabbed Russell by the beard and drug him around the room while Russell was yelling at the interpreter, talk pretty to him, talk pretty to him. And Victorio finally told the guy to let him go, and they took off.
That's awesome. I didn't know that story. And what's interesting is knowing what's going to happen later. I think it's in book 2. You kind of see how this whole thing just kind of snowballed into craziness.
Right.
Wow. History. So interesting. So, by the way, Yellow Boy does marry Juanita. Listeners, you'll have to read the book to find out about his courting her and the Apache rituals, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in book 2. But coming into the picture is the Apache chief Victorio, as you mentioned. His charisma pulled fighting men to him like iron to a magnet. Victorio was dangerous to both the Inda, murdering and raiding across the Apacheria that covered New Mexico, Arizona, and most of northern Mexico, and the Shishinda, which is what the Apache called themselves, as you mentioned before. So Yellow Boy believed Victorio wouldn't stay long after they gathered some Mescalero warrior. And as Yellow Boy tells it, when Victorio and Nane, is that how you said it?
Nane, yeah.
Nane rode off to Nane's Rinconada Canyon. I knew for certain Delgadito, Ka, and Kodo planned to join Victorio if he left the reservation, which they did, right?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, about 20 or 30 Mescalero warriors went with Victorio for the thrill of it. As Yellow Boy told the story, in the season of large fruit, that would be late August, Victorio learned that the Grant County authorities had issued indictments against him for horse stealing and murder and might come for him. And as luck would have it, a few days after Victorio heard about the Grant County indictments, he saw Judge Warren Bristol, Albert Fountain, who just happened to be Henry Fountain's father.
I was going to say, there's got to be a connection, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And several others he recognized crossed the reservation on a hunting and fishing trip. They didn't care anything about trying to capture Victorio, but the sight convinced him that they were coming to arrest him. And despite pleas from Mescalero chiefs, Doc Blazier, he and Delgado, Ka, and Kodo jumped the reservation in early September to leave a trail of blood and murder across southern New Mexico.
It seems like some of those warriors are young and ready to get out there and, make big change and go after the bad guys. Is that the correct interpretation?
Yeah, I think so. You're starting to see glimmers here of the problem that the Apaches were going to face on the reservation. You could have women have their hahe times, regardless of whether they were at war or peace or raiding or not. But how in the world were they going to have the boys declared men if they couldn't go raiding or become novitiates? And it was a real problem across all of the Apache bands. In fact, it got Geronimo in trouble. He was a Chiricahua.
Yeah, so there's that side of the story that kind of helps you understand it a little bit better. So Victorio and his shenanigans ended up causing issues for the Mescaleros. So Yellow Boy heard some men talking, saying, "I was over to Fort Stanton not long ago talking to a sergeant friend of mine. He's claiming that the Army thinks old Victorio is getting men, guns, and horses from the Indians on the res here, and they're going to put a stop to it by taking their horses and guns away. Can you believe it? Why, the Rio Tularosa will run red with blood. The Mescaleros need their guns and horses to hunt and defend themselves. They ain't going to part with their guns." Well, things started coming to a boiling point, and on April 12th, 1880, Yellow Boy looked on from the watch point as the Army, as well as the Chiricahua Apache scouts, marched into the reservation and took several women from the camp, including Juanita, dear woman, their mothers, and others. The story behind this infiltration was described by Yellow Boy. "I knew Russell had acted like a fool for refusing to bend the rules in last year's season of large fruit to give Victorio rations without written approval from Washington. His fear of doing something for which Washington bureaucrats might criticize him had enraged Victorio and started a war that left southern New Mexico burning and many ranchers, miners, and sheep herders slaughtered. So this goes back to what you were saying earlier, too.
Right.
So when you're talking Mescalero Apache against the Bluecoats, there's no comparison. But the Apache were better trackers, strategists, survivors, and fighters. But Chiricahua Apache versus Mescalero Apache is also another story, right?
Yeah, there were significant differences. The Mescaleros were warriors and fighters, but they weren't. I don't think quite in the league with the Chiricahuas, although
Oh,
the
really?
ethnologists say that the Chiricahua and the Mescalero are very similar in customs and life ways. But I think every Apache that was not a Chiricahua viewed the Chiricahua as the real deadly warriors, and they were deadly fighters. And until they surrendered about 8 years later in this story, they were leaders in the war against the White Eyes. Mescaleros had a good thing going on their reservation, and their chiefs didn't want another war with the White Eyes. And so they
Okay.
did everything they could to discourage those warriors going with Victorio.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I didn't realize the Chiricahua were really known for their being even greater warriors technically than the Mescalero. So Yellow Boy was off to rescue the women along with his fellow warriors, Closen and Bialachiesi. Help me and our listeners know how to pronounce that, Michael.
Well, you're asking a bad reference, but I call him Bialachiesi.
Bialachiesi. Okay. So he formulates a plan where they'd send one of their own into the camp to join the women. And then what happens next?
Well, keep in mind what's going on here is that Colonel Hatch has brought in literally hundreds of soldiers from many different directions, and they have forced the Mescaleros into one big camp around the agency, and they have managed to get all the women and children that were in the Yellow Boy camp perfectly minding their business in this place. And so the thing that they felt they had to do was to get their children back. And once they did, and that's kind of a long story itself. Once they did, they decided to head for Wool's camp in Mexico. Now, Whoa was probably at that time the premier war chief of any of the Apache tribes, and they stopped on their way to rest at Rufus Pike's place. Yellow Boy was smart enough to know that the army would send some scouts after the women and children that had left, and anyone else that was with them. And Yellow Boy and his warriors tried to intercept them, but the scouts never came the way that they thought that they would. And when they returned to Rufus Pike's place, the scouts had taken over their camp. Keeping watch, they spotted 6 Bluecoat Chiricahua Apaches, 6 scouts. One of them was named Soldado Fierro.
Don't forget that name, y'all.
Yeah, means fierce soldier. And Yellow Boy describes how he paced before the nearest fire and stared into the dark, looking from one side of the canyon that Rufus Pike lived in to the other, cocking his head to catch any unusual sound which he thought he heard. As Yellow Boy tells it, Before Soldado Fierro seated his rifle butt against his shoulder, I shouted, "Hold or die." He slowly lowered his rifle and, looking over his shoulder, nodded back to the other scouts to do the same. "I speak true. Lay down your rifles and pistols and no harm comes. We'll talk. Choose to fight and you'll die. Choose now." He laid down his rifle, drew his long-barreled Colt from its holster, and laid it down. The other scouts followed his example. I said, "You wear blue coats. You've come to kill us because the blue coat chief wars with Victorio. We don't ride with Victorio. We don't war against Inda. We're going to the far blue mountains and won't come back. Go back to the blue coat chief and say you didn't find us. Leave and you'll live. Stay and you'll die." Soldado Fierro crossed his arms and stared back into the dark. He said through clenched teeth, "We'll go. We won't track you to the blue mountains." Soldado Fierro smiled slightly, shrugged, and took a step back, and then, glancing toward Juanita, turned in slow motion to reach for his guns, which were lying by his moccasins. A soft slapping sound, like a fist striking an open palm, broke the stillness. He grunted, collapsed to his knees, and fell face forward into the sand without another sound.
So wow, Juanita is a boss. I doubt Deer Woman would have been able to take Soldado down. Right?
Right.
No way. Deer Woman's too busy in the bushes. So anyway, they made their way to camp of Nedni Apache Chief Woe, who welcomed them. And they told him of the witch killing their people and how Yellow Boy would take his rifle and kill the witch. So Woe challenged Yellow Boy, thinking he was too young and inexperienced of a warrior to do such a thing. So he basically said, "Oh yeah, try me." And y'all wouldn't believe what test he gave to Yellow Boy. They brought out a 5 or 6-year-old little girl who carried a gourd in her hand. And the book reads, "The whimpering child, her short legs churning, ran behind her, pulling on the rope with both hands to keep from being choked." So Woe said, "I took this slave a moon ago on my last raid against the Nakayes. I thought maybe if she lived one day, she will become one of us and give a man sons, which we need. But she will not stop her noise. Now I think soon I'll have to cut her throat. She'll never be an Apache if she can't be silent." It's not funny, but it's just, anyway. So the slave will run for the tree. Shoot the gourd off the child without a scratch from your bullet before she reaches the tree, and I will agree that Usten has given you power to kill witches and leave them blind in the land of the grandfathers. The woman kicked the child's legs out from under her, knocking her on her back. The wind knocked out of her lungs. The child tried to yell, but choking for air made nothing but a sucking, wheezing sound. The woman pulled the child's hair up off the sides of her head and used hair and string to tie the gourd in place on top of her head. The child got up and ran toward the tree in an awkward, wobbling gait that made her path crooked and unpredictable. The gourd tied in her hair was an impossible target, difficult to see, bouncing and jiggling, swaying back and forth as she ran. I brought the rifle's butt plate to my shoulder, sighted, and without hesitating, fired. The child was within 10 yards of the tree when the gourd exploded, showering chunks of gourd, pulp, and seeds all over her. The men who watched grunted in wonder and shook their heads in disbelief. And Woe turned to me. "Truly, Usen has given you a powerful gift. Come to my lodge when the shadows are shortest. Then I'll say to you what I know of the witch you hunt." Yeah, so what the heck, that poor little girl. All right, so Yellow Boy, with his newfound respect from Woe, had a sit down to hear what Woe had to say. Why don't you read that passage to us?
Yeah. Yellow Boy, sorry.
You're
Woe
fine.
is speaking to Yellow Boy. "A few years ago, I learned that a Nakagi, maybe part Comanche, called Sangre del Diablo, blood of the devil, was a brujo, a witch, and a scalp hunter. The merchants in Casas Grandes had a trick they liked to use on Apaches. They offered us many gifts when they asked us to come in to Casa Grandes for peace discussions and presents so we'd leave them alone in our raids. At the meetings, they gave us whiskey from a barrel that had no bottom to make us too drunk to defend ourselves. And then they killed as many of us as possible before the rest ran away. We loved the powerful whiskey of the Nakies so much that we took the bait twice in the span of 15 years and saw the slaughter of many warriors. I once ran into the witch with the sun's glow behind him, a giant, naked man, his arms up, a human skull in each hand, strange, swirling signs tattooed on his torso, tattoos that looked like fire around his wrists and up his arms, his legs painted red, his face black with touches of white to make it look like a skull, and an owl, death in the flesh, its wings spread and hover, ready to fly, perched on his shoulder. We stared at each other for a long moment before the figure said, "I am Sangre del Diablo. I hold in my hands the spirits of death. If I curse you, you'll get sick and die. Come to my land, and you and all your Nedne will surely die. I'll show you the way. I'll show you the way to his hacienda. We'll leave when the sun comes tomorrow." Sticking out my chin, I said through clenched teeth, "Show the way."
I love this. Mic drop, show me the way. Take me to him. He sounds really evil and creepy. So the next part cracks me up. Juanita said, "Whoa, sent a slave. She's young, cries often, and stinks of gourd. I'll keep her and teach her to work for me and show her our ways." So I love Juanita. She's such a good person. She's a good shot, and she's willing to take in the stinky gourd kid. So it seems like big scary things are about to happen with the witch. So do tell us what happened as they approached the camp of the witch as we bite our fingernails.
So they found a place to camp and hide outside the place where the witch was, which was on a large pond and a creek, and they crept around to watch what was going on the night that it started. And the book says hollow log drums pounded a steady thumping rhythm that made it easy to lose all sense of time and space. Around the flames, tall and graceful, with long, shiny black hair and braids that often reached to their waists, danced Indians of a tribe I had never seen before. Scattered among the circle of Comanches were drunken Nakiye vaqueros, probably banditos, who laughed and cursed as they staggered around the fire, poorly imitating the smooth Comanche dance, steps and gyrations. All the dancers held their right hands high in the firelight and shook scalps of shiny black hair. Standing in front of an ornately carved chair, painted in yellow and black, arms crossed, and watching the dancers was the tallest, biggest Nakiye, or perhaps Nakiye Indio mix I had ever seen. The drum stopped, and the men grew quiet and stood to face the giant. He rose out of the chair and, raising his arms, said in a deep voice they could all hear, "I sangre del Diablo. Call the witch's ghost for my power. The ghost will fill me and guide us. Soon we'll go. Be ready. We'll take many scalps, slaves, cattle, and horses. Take your pleasures now. The trail leads far. The men raised their arms and howled like wolves, and the women made long, yodeling screams like hunting mountain lions. All that noise made the hair on the back of my neck tingle. Near dawn, when the fire was growing low, the giant, bleary-eyed from drinking too much, pointed at a woman and yelled for her to bring him his sack. Grinning, he untied the top and ran his arm down into the bag and retrieved a scalp, long dried, perhaps even specially cured. Its black hair was long, and it filled his fist as he held it up and howled like a wolf and shook it. The scalp still had the ears attached, and from the left ear hung pieces of turquoise on a silver wire, like Caballo Negro wore. Yellow Boy goes back to the others. He watches, pale, his skin gray in the early morning shade, said, when the moon was high, shining straight down on the lake, I heard an owl call my name. 3 times it called. The witch is trying to kill me. That witch knows we're here. He kills us in a bad way. I say, we go away and like, whoa, leave him alone. But the men didn't change their plans and decided to attack men who the witch had sent to Casas Grandes.
So Closen and Bilachezi ran for the ambush spot, and less than 2 miles from where he watches rode off with their horses. I know the sweat must have already covered their bodies after running in that hot, brilliant sunlight when they crawled under the blankets covered with dirt and sand and waited. Their rifles cocked, they waited, barely breathing, ignoring the thick, fiery air scorching their throats and filling their lungs. Closen kept his ear pressed to the ground, listening for approaching horses. He held up 4 fingers to indicate 4 horses and made the sign for a wagon. They said the shots, barely distinguishable, they were so close together, they knocked the vaquero off his horse and the wagon driver off his seat. And of course, they were successful in killing the men. So this is such an interesting strategy. Was this typical for the Apaches to hide in the ground under blankets covered in dirt?
Yeah, as I've said, the standard Apache method of attack and fighting was ambush. It was the safest way to fight. Very rarely did they charge head on into an enemy. And their ambush techniques required them to hide in places that their enemies would never dream they would be. Sometimes that meant digging a shallow hole and hiding under a dirt-covered blanket.
Oh, it'd be so hot out there too, though.
Yeah.
I can't imagine. But I loved how stealthy they were and their training that they had been given by their fathers, elders, and all that it really made them so good at what they did. So far, things are going well, but Sangre del Diablo soon figures out that his camp is being watched and soon takes Yellow Boy and he watches prisoner. Yellow Boy finds himself in a pickle, knocked out by the Comanches and with a tremendous headache. Segundo, who was second in command, was standing there, his upper torso naked, covered in black paint up to his neck, his head now hairless, covered in white, with black paint used around his eyes and cheekbones to make his head look like a floating skull, stood grinning at me like death back from the grave. He's then led out to where he could join He Watches. And what did he see?
There were 2 poles planted in the ground facing each other, and in the middle was a fire, and the poles had a cross piece on their top, and they were basically crosses. Stools stood against the poles, and He Watches, forced to climb up on it, managed to rise up and stand with his back to the pole. One of his painted keepers climbed a ladder, leaned against the back side of the pole, and pulled He Watches' arms straight out along the crosspiece and tied them with pieces of wet rawhide at his shoulder, elbow, and hand joints. He Watches' face showed no emotion. His eyes, staring at his captors, calm, unafraid. I was tied like he watches on the opposite pole. The drum stopped and all voices in the crowd grew silent. The only sounds, the hiss and pop of the fire giving off the tart, soothing smell of burning cedar. A naked giant lifted his arms high, a human skull in each hand, strange, swirling, symmetrical signs in black tattooed all over his torso that disappeared into orange and red flames, painted around his waist, and long streams of red and white flames covered his big muscular arms. His legs were covered in red paint from his breechcloth crotch all the way to his beaded moccasins. The swirls on his body grew steadily wider and more intricate until they converged at his shoulders and merged with black, glistening paint covering his bald head. A huge owl, its wings slightly extended for balance and a leather hood covering its eyes, stood on the specter's shoulder. Its talons dug into a thick leather roll held in place with straps across the specter's chest and back, buckled together in gleaming silver and connected to the owl's silver chain leg leash.
I can just picture this scene. It's like creepy. So the giant unleashes the owl, and then your book reads, in a few seconds, the outstretched talons of the great owl swooped out of the night and stabbed into the eyes and face of He Watches. He jerked his head from side to side, trying to throw off the owl as the raptor tore at his face and eyes and made sharp thrusts with its beak at the back of his neck, near the base of his skull, ripping and tearing flesh. Watching death come to my grandfather, I strained in cold fury against the rawhide holding me, vowing the witch's death and asking Usin for his promised power. He Watches, blinded, blood streaming from many rips in his face and eyes, bowed his head and struggled no more. The owl with its great beak tearing at the base of his skull had finally broken his neck and released him to the land of the grandfathers. The owl hopped to He Watch's shoulder and, facing Sangre del Diablo, screeched his kill with outspread wings. This is so tragic. Listeners, are you devastated like I am? And He Watches had this vision, which came true. So I noticed there's a lot of talk in the book about blinding the enemies, taking out their eyes. Was this a part of some tribes' culture?
Blinding enemies before they were killed was unusual, but not rare. The only way a blind person could survive in the wilderness was to have his people around him to help him. And if there were none to help, starvation, wandering off cliffs, predatory animals were all hard ways to die.
Oh. So what happens next to Yellow Boy after watching his grandfather die this horrible death?
The witch had not found Closen and Bila Cheesy, and they saved Yellow Boy from the cross after the witch and his people went to bed. Closen on a ladder against the back of the pole, and this is how the book tells it. Slashed my wrists free, cut the rawhide at my elbows and my arms. Numb, they flopped down by my sides, and Yellow Boy falls to the ground. He stared at me, shook his head in disbelief, helped me up, and motioned to Bila Cheesy to bring the body of He Watches and follow them. Yellow Boy tells Closen, the witch calls the second chief Segundo. He sleeps somewhere in the hacienda. I must have my rifle back to kill the witch. Closen finds the rifle, but is discovered. And the book reads, Segundo ran for the gates, but Closen separated from a black hall entranceway and swung his rifle like a club into the back of his head. He sprawled forward, landing hard, face down on the walkway leading to the gates. The Yellow Boy flying from his hands. Closen had actually found the yellow boy, but the segundo had it, and he was trying to figure out how to get it away from him. And the book reads, Closen drove his knee down between Segundo's shoulder blades, drew his knife, grabbed his hair to yank his head back, but the hair came off with a weak tearing sound, braids and all. Closen stuffed the hair in his belt as I ran to the yellow boy, picked it up and sighed with relief and whispered my rifle. Segundo, blood smeared over his face, a knife in his hand, screaming a ghost-raising Comanche war cry, ran for Closen. On top of the compound wall, I rose to my knees and whipped the Henry to my shoulder and bellowed, Segundo! Reflexively, Segundo looked toward me. In a snapping boom, his left eye disappeared and his head snapped back. His momentum took him another step, his head turning toward the sound of the rifle. His right eye, wide open, suddenly disappeared in another crack of thunder, leaving only a black socket. And the remaining backside of his head disappeared in a spray of blood, bone, and brains. He fell backwards and lay still not 3 yards from Closen. But where was Sangre del Diablo?
Where was he? That's a good question. Comanche howls came from somewhere amid the horses, which ran out of the corral and pounded straight for us. Dragging Closen, who had been badly wounded between us, we ran for the compound gates. Howling like specters out of hell, 2 Comanches and the witch rolled up from their horses' necks, where they had been hanging. Bullets from the Comanches' rifles raised like plumes of dust around us, and the ground shook from the pounding hooves of the horses running for us. So the Apache were horse people, but the Comanche were as well. And on that note, we talked about the Chiricahua versus the Mescalero Apache, and how the Chiricahua tended to be even greater warriors and greater skills. What about the Comanche versus the Apache?
Well, you have to realize that the Comanches were true horse warriors. They fought while they rode.
Amazing.
The Apaches were mounted infantry. In other words, they looked at a horse as a tool, not as a measure of wealth like the Comanches did. And so when an Apache fought, he usually rode a horse to the engagement and then got off standing on the ground. The Comanches never did that. They stayed on their horses. They were true cavalry.
That's amazing. Yeah, I'm just amazed at the skill of these people on their horses, the Comanche and the Apache, but especially the Comanche. So anyway, Closen would have held them back. So, like a hero, he told Bila Chezi and Yellow Boy to go onward without him since he was wounded. So why are you doing this to me, Michael? I liked Closen. He was so loyal.
Yeah, he was a good man.
Yeah.
The Apaches believed in what they called a good death, which meant that a warrior died showing courage and protecting the people. Closen and he watches had good deaths on both accounts. Yellow Boy tells of their burial in a canyon on the way to Woe's camp, or I should say on the way back to Woe's camp. We carried the bodies of he watches and Closen to the place by the trees. We led the ponies of he watches and Closen close to the graves. We positioned them where we wanted them to fall and then killed them with our knives quickly and mercifully. He watches was getting too old and slow for rage and war, but he wouldn't part with it when we had left the witch. Now he took it to the happy land, and Socorro would not grieve for him every time she saw it.
And speaking of Socorro, again, that's he watches wife. They get back to the camp, weary with losses and only partially successful as they still hadn't killed the witch. And Yellow Boy now has to tell Socorro that he watches went to the happy land. She raised her chin and looked in my eyes. I hear you, grandson. I go to the other side of the mountain and mourn him. Go to your woman's teepee. Think of me no more. She turned from me and disappeared into the trees. I sighed and watched her go, knowing I would never see her again. So this killed me. It's so bittersweet, but there was some good news in the camp. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so after returning, Yellow Boy sees Juanita and says, "You look different. I can tell you hide something from me." She coyly bent her head to look at her moccasin, and then looking in my eyes, smiled and said, "By next season of Little Eagles, I think you will have a son." My eyes sparkled as I held her and whispered, "Inju."
Yay. Finally, some good news.
Yeah.
But we still have the issue of the witch escaping, and Yellow Boy wasn't yet able to avenge his father. So the book says, I found Woe on his blanket under the tall pines. He waved for me to join him. After I sat down, he said, a Membreno warrior with a message from Victorio came in last night. He told me a story I know you'll want to hear. He said he is hidden in the bosque resting his horse on the Rio Grandes when he saw a horse or maybe a giant witch riding with two Comanches wipe out 3 wagons filled with women and children on the wagon road to Casa Grandes. A baby survived and the witch didn't let the Comanches kill it. He took it and said he was leaving it with a woman in Casa Grandes. They burned the bodies with the wagons, and the warrior heard the witch say the stupid Nacayes would believe the Apaches did it, even though the horses had been killed. He told the Comanches to go to the camp of Elias, and he would meet them there in 3 moons. So Woe crossed his arms and shook his head. Elias is Apache. He has the main camp on the western side of the Blue Mountains, north of the pass the Nacayes called El Paso Pulpito. Sometimes he goes north and crosses the border when he can get enough banditos to ride with him or when Geronimo sends word. In 4 days, I will send a warrior to show you the way to the camp of Elias. I saw the faint smile of breaking on Woe's lips and knew Osun was giving me another chance to destroy the witch.
And there ends our story for now.
Wait, what? You're leaving us with a cliffhanger. And what's the deal with this baby the witch didn't let the Comanches kill? You're killing me, man.
You just have to read the second book, Blood of the Devil, to learn what happens in the clash between the witch, Sangre del Diablo, and the third book, The Last Warrior, to learn what happens to the child.
I haven't read the third one yet. So I'm still, and I'm only mostly through Blood of the Devil. So, Oh my gosh, it's really hard to put down too. My husband's been on a 2-week trip, and at night I've been sitting in front of the fireplace reading this stuff, and I'm all alone, and I'm like, oh, this is so creepy. So good. So, okay, fine then. Listeners, you don't want to miss part 2, Blood of the Devil. So stay tuned. And Michael, thanks again for joining me and for sharing this suspenseful, heartbreaking, and informative story, Killer of Witches, The Life and Times of Yellow Boy.
It's truly been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Cookie. Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Simply search for Native Chalk Talk. That's Native, CHOCTALK. And check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.